morning. I have a very simple question to begin. It's the first of three questions I'm going to ask you this morning. And I mean it quite literally, as you see on the screen. What is your image of the future? When you think of the future, whether it's 6 months or 6 years or 60 years in the future or more, what kind of word pops into your head? What kind of picture? What kind of phrase or thought? When Steve Jobs asked that question, what he saw was tools for the mind that would change humankind. When Bill Gates asked that question, he saw a computer on every desktop and a computer in every home, a little more practical one. When Henry Ford asked that question, he saw mobility for the masses. What is your image of the future? All innovation really begins, I think, with somebody having an image of the future which is different. And that's the really most important first question. There is a follow-up question, which is question number 2. And that is really, why is this an important question? I'm going to go back, and we can't see the word on the top of that, and it should say, the future creates the present. Why is it important to ask, what is your image of the future? It's because the future creates the present. It's the opposite of how we think that life works, although it's really the flip side of the very same coin, right? We know that we do things in the present, we make decisions, we carry out actions, and we believe that that is somehow going to shape or create the future world that we're going to live in. But the opposite is true as well. The image of the future that we have, whatever your answer to that question is, whether you think about it deliberately or whether it's relatively unconscious, exerts an influence over the choices and the decisions that you make in the present world. If you want to change the world today, change the future. Change what you expect to happen that you're trying to get ready for. Change what you think is possible, that you would like to try to create if you could. Most importantly, change what is preferred. Change your answer to the question, what is our preferred future, or what is my preferred future, in a way that actually matters to you, and you'll see things that you ought to be doing differently today. Here's a quick story about some companies that didn't ask that question, or if they asked it, they didn't really pay much attention to their answer. Exactly 20 years ago, Fortune magazine did a cover story. On the cover were 3 dinosaur shapes. The dinosaur shapes each had a name. Their names were IBM, Sears, and General Motors. In 1993, Fortune was seriously asking, have these 3 companies become dinosaurs, literally in danger of going extinct? What was interesting about that year in 1993 is that exactly 30 years before, the great management thinker, Peter Drucker, had named the 3 best managed companies in the history of the world. And their names were Sears, IBM, and General Motors. What happened to those 3 companies by 1993? And by the way, each has been working since 1993 not to go extinct, with varying degrees of success, of course. What happened is, all kinds of things, of course, in the organization or in the company, but one of the things that quite clearly happened to each of those 3 companies is that they each had an image of the future of retailing, or the future of the computing business, or the future of the automobile business, and they focused on innovation and strategies that would make them successful in that future. Meanwhile, the world was going over here, either before they noticed or before they took seriously what they were noticing, probably the latter. That is, most organizations are full of people who are saying, hey, wait a minute, the world's going over here. And the response in the organization is, we don't have time for that right now. Or, we have too much sunk investment in the way we're doing things now. Or, I'm only 2 years to retirement, just leave me alone. You can worry about that after I'm gone. What is your image of the future, and why does it matter? It matters because the future creates the present. The most potent leverage point for change in any organization, or I think in any person's life, is your image of the future. If you want to change what you're doing now, change your image of the future. So what is my image of the future? My image of the future is really dominated by certain driving forces or trends which are shaping the future. And they are technology acceleration, demographic dynamics, consumers and culture, sustainability issues, economic turbulence, and then a little bit about values. And I want to just mention each of those fairly briefly. Let's start with technology acceleration. One of the most interesting things about the economic downturn of the last several years is the way that technology has continued to accelerate despite the economic turbulence that we've been living through. And that economic and that turbulence has especially been characterized by developments in these fields that you see on the screen: connectivity, convergence, three-dimensional communication, nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology. The newer field of cognitive technology, you might have noticed that the federal government decided in the last year to pour a lot of research money into better understanding how the brain works. I used to work at a lab that was connected to and studied how the brain is in fact interacting with machines. We call it the Human Interface Technology Lab at the University of Washington. And then finally there are robotics technologies. And in each of those fields we continue to see and will continue to see developments. Here's just one quick example. I was chatting with a guy from IBM who has actually been relatively successful since 1993 as they changed their business model and started thinking differently about their company. And he was telling me about a little research piece that he had just seen, this was just 2 weeks ago, in which IBM researchers are figuring out how to, as we know, as known for some time, to move atoms around atom by atom by atom. And he said, I've been asking myself, why is this important? And he said, here's why. Because right now, in order to store a bit of information, it takes several hundreds of thousands or millions of atoms in order to store a bit of information in a machine. But if you could store a bit of information for each atom, we could have a tremendous leap in the ability to store information. And he said, in fact, I expect that that's going to happen. Technology acceleration is the first force. And the thing that technology acceleration really brings to the fore is the potential of true game changers. One of the organizations that I'm working with right now is one that has as its global vision to be the world leader in sustainable habitat. And they're especially interested in the potential of 3D printing to print both materials that go into the building of homes, but eventually, perhaps, to build entire homes. And there are conceptual drawings, at least, of large-scale 3D printers printing entire buildings or printing entire homes on site. And already lots of experiments in building materials using 3D printing. One of the things that we're interested in when you think about innovation is what will be the real game changers? It's not enough just to ask what's new. It's more important to ask what is new that will actually change the world? What is it that we need that will actually change the world in a way that makes the world better? That's the first driver, technology acceleration. The second driver of change and possibility for innovation is the most predictable aspect of the future, and that's the shape and nature of the population. Now, I have 3 kids. They're all millennial kids. When my wife and I were thinking about whether or not to have kids, which is a decision that most couples make, this is a true story. I happened to be in a supermarket one day, and in front of me was a young mother with 3 very unruly kids. She'd had kids, maybe 2 of them were twins, and maybe one was just only a year or 2 apart. They were under 3 years old. They were crying and messing around as they tend to do in the checkout line, and she was trying to struggle with them and all of her groceries. And although I'm a relatively shy person, at this moment I wasn't, and I leaned over to her and I said, my wife and I are thinking about having kids. If you had to do it all over again, would you do it? She smiled, thought for a second. She said, yeah, I would, not the same ones. But I would do it again. The most predictable aspect of the future is the shape and the nature of the population. What do we know about where the population is going? We know 3 fundamental things. First of all, we know that in the United States, the population is becoming more diverse. 70% of all population growth between now and 2030 will be among groups that we have formerly labeled as minorities. And by 2040, according to the US Census Bureau, the groups that we have formerly labeled minorities will be the majority of the US population. Yet most of our organizational management ranks and most of our organizational boardrooms don't reflect that. And the question is, what will it take for the organization management ranks and boardrooms to start reflecting that by 2030 or so, when this whole world begins to flip? That's development number one, and it's a really interesting one. The second one, characterized as well by what you see on the screen, is the growth of the older population. It was back in 1990 that Ken Deitwald wrote that very famous book called The Age Wave. And in The Age Wave, he said, starting in about the year 2011, baby boomers will begin to turn 65 years old. And when that happens, the world will begin to change. Now we're there. Historically, people lived to be 65, but it was relatively rare to live to be 65 until recent decades. Now, as we all know, it's very common to live to be 65. Now, in this state, if you look around, I don't know how many of you, I presume most of you are from the state of Georgia. There might be one or two of you are from out of town like myself. Georgia is a little bit younger than the state of Washington, but in both of our states, it's around 11, 12, 13% of the population who are over the age of 65. That means today, if we're walking down the street, about 1 out of every 10 people we see should be over the age of 65, right? By 2025, in the US, we will have 37 Floridas. If you want to see the future, just go to Florida and look around. Now in Florida, we're approaching 20% of the population over the age of 65, and that'll be true of 37 states, including this one, although Georgia will continue to be a little bit younger because you attract so many young people to move here. But what will it mean just a little over a decade from now when you're walking down the streets and 1 out of every 5 people you see, and in some cities, 1 out of every 4 people you see is over the age of 65? What do we need to innovate in terms of housing, in terms of transportation, in terms of social services, in terms of technology? And on and on and on and on. Just about every product or service that you can name needs innovation in response to that kind of a population profile, which, by the way, has never existed in the history of the world. We've embarked on this grand social experiment, and the experimental question is, how should you organize a society when a quarter or a fifth of the population is over 65? We are the ones who are going to find that out. We are both the experimenters and the experimental subjects. And there's a lot of innovation that will happen and must happen in response to that. That's the second of the big demographic trends after diversity. That is, the second one being aging. And the third one is the emergence of the next generation. Now, the book that just came out today on Amazon as an ebook called Millennial City, How a New Generation Can Save the Future, we have aimed toward the millennial generation. As I mentioned, I have these three millennial kids. Now, these are kids born since about 1980. Up until about 2000. The kids born after 2000 are the post-millennial generation. They don't really even have a name yet. But what is different about the millennial generation? The most important difference, there's many things that are different about them, but the most important one is you see on the screen, and that is they are the first digital native generation, a term that was coined by Mark Prensky. Now, digital natives means, quite obviously, they're the first generation to grow up since computers, right? That is, everybody in this room is familiar with computers, but some of us are not digital natives. How many of you, if I might ask, in this room are digital natives? How many of you were born after 1980? Raise your hands really high. If you're in the front of the room, kind of look over your shoulder a little bit and see how many digital natives that we have in the room. Quite a few. And then everybody else in the room who didn't raise their hand is a digital immigrant, right? Now, as a digital immigrant, you might actually be in charge of IT for your organization, and you might be quite skilled and comfortable with computing. But believe me, it is very different if it's been there since you were an infant, if it's been there since you were a child.